This year at the Oscars, the Iranian film The Seed of the Sacred Fig was nominated for the Best International Feature. However, the film, instead of Iran, was represented by Germany. This was due to the political content of the film, which is explicitly in dissent with the current Iranian regime. The production of the film was marked by chaos and drama, as it had to be secretly filmed in Iran, and as a result of the recent court-ordered arrest, the director, Mohammad Rasoulof, had to flee the country and complete the post-production in Germany. The film instantly garnered praise for the bravery of its filmmakers and was awarded various film festivals and circuits, from the Cannes Film Festival to its eventual nomination for the Golden Globes and the Oscars. Now, some critics in Iran may call this film an epitome of the festival film. This term that has been around in Iran for 2 or 3 decades is a degraded description of filmmakers who are making films for international festival attention and foreign consumption rather than making films to serve the Iranian populace. In recent years, the main criterion of these kinds of films is their political implications, which are mostly up on the Western audience and critics' assumptions of political dissent in Iran. And to be fair, this film can be read as that. However, even films like A Separation or The Salesman, which had been well received by the Iranians and were one of the best-selling films of their respective years in the domestic market, hadn't been able to escape such criticism. So one can argue that this is just the one-sided perspective of these films, as any film which gets the international attention can become the target of this label. In my view, whether they are intentionally political or not, these films are always going to be politicized. In fact, rather than just dismissing them as another festival film, they can be a great asset for us to understand the political context of Iran and its relationship to the world. Especially the 4 films which had been nominated for the Oscars can illuminate the political relationship between Iran and the US in their respective periods. That's why in this video I'll focus on these 4 films and 3 subjects surrounding them. First, the context of Iranian cinema regarding the content of these films. Second, these films' representation or maybe the lack of representation of Iranian politics of their time. And finally, how these films' nominations or even getting awarded tell us about the relationship between Iran and the US. In 1998, the first Iranian film ever to be nominated for the Oscars was Children of Heaven. It's about a schoolboy who lives on the outskirts of Tehran. One day, he loses his sister's shoes, so the whole film revolves around his problem as he and his sister try to navigate their daily life living with one shoe, his shoe, as in their view, their father can't afford to buy new shoes for the moment. Finally, a break is encountered. There is a running competition, and if he wins the 3rd place, he would be awarded new pairs of sneakers. So he signs up for the contest, but to his ironic fate, he gets so wound up to finish sooner than everyone that he gets the 1st place. So in this sensational climax, he feels like a loser even though he was the ultimate winner. But the film doesn't end there. We, as the audience, see that his father has indeed bought a pair of shoes for his sister. Therefore, the film ends with a positive note. This film actually comes from almost 3 decades long child-centered Iranian film that from the outset grabbed the attention of the outside world. The production of these types of films in Iran goes back to the pre-Islamic Revolution in 1979. Amir Ali Nujumian, in his article, explains, the advent of Iranian children's films for children coincides with the establishment of the Center for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, also known as Kanun, in 1965. Kanun was initially founded by Farhadi, the Queen of Iran at the time, for the purpose of developing cultural centers and libraries all around the country in cities and villages. These films were heavily inspired by documentary-style filmmaking and Italian neorealist cinema. Aside from the artistic choice, I think there was a certain practicality in choosing this way of on-location filmmaking and the subject matter. They could make a film with a modest budget. In addition, especially after the Islamic Revolution and the heavy censorship on various subjects, child-centered films were one of the few subjects that could be made without a pressure from a new revolutionary authorities. Many great Iranian directors work on that center, but the most influential one perhaps was Abbas Kiarostami, who continued working with the center even after the revolution. His most notable film from that period ought to be the most influential one on Children of Heaven. The film was called Where is My Friend's House? One could argue that the plot is almost the same, only instead of a shoe, the main protagonist accidentally brings his friend's notebook with him, and the movie revolves around his attempt to get back that notebook to his friend. Plus, the movie was set in one of the northern villages of Iran. Going back to Children of Heaven, arguably the film was more sensational and had more obvious sentimentality compared with that film, which to me is one of the indictments of why maybe it was more well received by the American Academy voters. Also, the film was more conservative about the depiction of adults and family life, and given that most of the child-centered films, namely Where's the Friend's House, were illustrating rigid adults and family structure in contrast with their child protagonists' curiosity and free spirits, which as Nujumian and others suspect symbolize the new life and modernity versus the traditional way of thinking, this film conversely paints a more wholesome picture of the family unit. This is where I think the political context of that era comes into light. The film reflects the changing attitude towards the outside world. As Nujumian says, the othering that was essential in the time of war in the 80s now has transformed to tolerance and companionship towards the other. A prime example of this in the film is when the boy and his sister discover that the missing shoe is in the possession of a girl with a brown father. Instead of arguing and claiming the shoe, they understand the hardship of the girl might be facing and let it go. I might add that the emergence of the reformist movement and the subsequent election of Mohammad Khatami, a more liberal political personality, as the new president in that era could be read into the film and its positivity towards the future in which the child protagonist represents. Although I should say that the film was made 1 year before the election, but one could argue that this discursive shift was already there. And this change in the political dynamic of Iran brings us to one other important reason that I suspect led to the first ever Iranian film to be nominated for the Oscars, and that's the optimistic outlook on the future of the diplomatic relation of this new moderate government of Iran and the US after 2 decades of constant hostility and tensions. I believe that played a significant role in getting this film nominated for the Oscars. This optimism didn't last long. Not only did the tensions remain between the two countries,
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom.
also things worsened within the country as well. Especially in 2009, there was a big demonstration against the now hardliner government after the result of the election that suspiciously was in favor of Ahmadinejad, the incumbent president. Many questioned the accuracy of the results, namely Mir Hossein Mousavi, the other candidate who was representing the Reformist Party. This led to a political crisis and demonstrations against the government and even the regime, and ended with a violent oppression of protesters and the house arrest of Mousavi. Iranian cinema, however, had witnessed a little bit of less restraint, especially during Mohammad Khatami's presidency. Therefore, some new variation of genres were developed and tackled by Iranian filmmakers. The most popular one would be comedy and romantic comedies. At the same time, one of the genres that dominated the more serious intellectual part of this generation of films were social realist films with melodramatic tendencies. Asghar Farhadi comes into prominence as one of the best filmmakers of this new variation of realist cinema, and in 2011 and 2016 his fifth and seventh feature films, A Separation, or as we Iranians call it, Jodayi Nader az Simin, and The Salesman, had been awarded the Oscar for the best international feature film. A Separation comes right after the events in 2009, and it's about such themes as immigration, class antagonism, divorce, poverty, and unemployment. I'm not going into detail about the plot, but Danielle Lerogo writes in her essay that the story centers on the conflict between Simin and her husband Nader. Following Simin's decision to leave Iran and take their daughter Termeh with her, Simin sues for divorce when Nader refuses to leave behind his Alzheimer's suffering father. But her request is unsuccessful. Nader then hires Razia to care for his father in his wife's absence. But when he discovers that the new carer has neglected her duties, he reacts angrily and pushes her out of the apartment. Following the incident, Razia accuses Nader of having caused her miscarriage, leading her husband Hojjat to take Nader to court. Realism in this movie partly comes from the same tradition of documentary-style filmmaking and naturalistic acting, which prominent Iranian films with international recognition prior to Farhadi employed from European cinema. However, there is also an influence from American cinema in the works of Farhadi as well. In her essay, Rugo observes Farhadi is a cosmopolitan director, one whose work stands the scrutiny of the American cinematic tradition and the issues that inform the West's transition to modernity, exposed through questions of marriage, self-knowledge, and publicness. Moreover, an argument inspired by Cabell's analysis of classical Hollywood films also illuminates the distant Farhadi's films marked with regard to post-revolutionary Iranian cinema by focusing on the urban middle class, its values, and lifestyle. Finally, the parallel with Cabell offers the opportunity to highlight specific thematic affinities with classical Hollywood cinema and sets up a film philosophical conversation on the work of Farhadi based on the moral issues these films confront. Adding to that, I think the twists and turns of his stories, especially in regard to a separation, is firstly an obvious departure from previous art house Iranian films, with a so-called open image and getting close towards a more conventional storytelling that might be more acceptable in the eyes of American audiences and critics. And secondly, the universality of the main themes of the film gives this film a transnational effect that, in addition to the previous argument, helped the film to get such recognition. This leads me to political aspects that have been read into the film. Some of the main themes like immigration and class antagonism could be considered within the context of post-2009 events as political allusions of the film. For instance, in his article, Masoud Golsorghi contends that Simin and Nader represent the maternal feeling of flight and the paternal need to stay and fight for the cause, the yin and yang of the movement for reform. And he adds, their fictional struggle echoes the political struggle that we see in Iran today. Nader's demand that Termeh stand up for herself when she is shortchanged by a garage worker echoes the protesters' question after the disputed presidential election, where is my change, or in this case, vote. On the other side of the coin, Razia and Hojjat, as Golsorghi observes, represent the traditional religious lower class, the bloc that allegedly supported the hardliner-backed candidate Ahmadinejad. The film shows compassion and sympathy towards these characters as well, although through an outside perspective. After all, we see them mostly within the context of the middle-class family and thus their perspective. This middle ground approach to the characters and the empathy that the film has for every one of them, I think, in the event of the relationship between Iran and the US, is another major political point. In this phase, as the so-called principalist had occupied the government of Iran, the ultra-conservative party, the foreign policy of the Iranian government had been overwhelmed by the new nuclear program of Iran and the subsequent crisis they further caused on the already fragile diplomatic relationship between the two countries. So with that in mind, Jonathan Rosenbaum interestingly asserts, I suspect that an important reason for this sort of enthusiasm for a separation is the desire of many Americans, or at least Americans who see foreign language films, not to go to war again, shortly after the very belated return of American troops from Iraq, and during the incessant and frightening beating of war drums by all the Republican candidates. In other words, the film worked like a double-edged sword, one that cut through the moral dogma of the Iranian state with its moral relativism and complex characterization of the issues at hand in contemporary Iran, but representing flawed characters while also empathizing with them, and simultaneously displayed the human condition in a broader and universal sense of the word. One that resonated with a progressive liberalism, especially within American society of the post 9/11 and Iraq War, and therefore with this discursive humanism cut through against the hardliners in American politics as well. Now, between 2011 and February 26, 2017, when The Salesman won the Oscar for the Best International Feature, a lot had happened between the US and Iran. After almost 40 years, a diplomatic deal was established between the two countries in 2015. The now moderate government of Rouhani and the government of Obama had reached a nuclear deal.
Long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
But lo and behold, a year and a half later, this guy became the president of the United States. And he did not like that deal.
We will not continue down a path whose predictable conclusion is more violence, more terror, and the very real threat of Iran's nuclear breakout.
And from then on, the tensions grew even bigger than ever before. But that's for the future. The Salesman was shot in the window of what I might call a spring of the Iran-US sort of revived diplomatic relationship. Asghar Farhadi, now a well-known figure in Iran following his Oscar win, returned to Iran after completing his French set and produced film, The Past, and then shot The Salesman. In short, The Salesman revolves around another middle-class family, now this time two struggling theater actors, Rana and her husband, Ahmad. The film starts when they have to move to another house as their house is literally crumbling. The former tenant of the new house was allegedly a prostitute. This leads to a disaster as Rana, without knowing this fact, opens the door without asking who's at the door. This leads to a sexual assault as the man thinks that the same woman lives there. The whole movie centers around this incident, leading to a tragic fate both for the couple and the old lower-class man who assaulted Rana. This time, the Americanized mode of storytelling is much more obvious, and one might say conscious. Ahmad and Rana are acting in a Death of a Salesman production, one of the most acclaimed American plays, and there are certain intertextual affinities with the play. One of the main themes of the play is concurrent with the film, the humiliation theme. This was especially noted by English-speaking reviewers and critics, along with the structure such as a separation that I discussed earlier, which resembled classical Hollywood. Therefore, I think this film, content-wise, had the same potential to catch the eye of American Academy voters. However, the event of the Oscars itself tells us about how politicized the decision to give the award to this film was. See, Trump immediately after assuming office enacted on what he called a Muslim ban, a travel ban imposed on 6 Muslim countries, including Iran, of course. This shocked a lot of people within film communities in the world as well.
Something in support of Asghar. We felt very deeply for him, and it seemed to me that he took a principled stand against something that was pretty outrageous.
As a result, Farhadi refused to travel to the US for the Academy Awards ceremony. Instead, Anousheh Ansari and Firuz Naderi, 2 Persian-born Americans who worked in NASA, accepted the award on his behalf. In this way, the message was clear from him and the Academy to this new government. So one can't dispute that this was maybe one of the most political awards given to any film in the history of the Oscars. This is not to say or reduce this film as a festival film as mentioned before, but one might suspect that hadn't Trump won the election, The Salesman wouldn't have been the winner. Ironically, and except for this award, in the next 8 years after Trump's ascension to power, things get quite complicated and worse for someone like Asghar Farhadi. As I explained, Trump's administration withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran, which had been in place since 2015, and sanctions again were subsequently implemented. This impacted our economy even before it materialized. Since then, we, the people of Iran, have been living with the broken economy and head-spinning inflation. We're getting poorer every day. At the same time, a lot of people in Iran have been disillusioned with the Iranian state apparatus, and even the Reformist Party and its leaders have been called into question as being just a vehicle for this regime's legitimacy. The chaotic economy and the crisis in domestic politics led to two of the biggest uprisings since the Islamic Revolution. In 2019 and 2022, these events took place in different cities in Iran, both of which met with an unprecedented violent oppression of people by the police and special forces. The second one was provoked by killing a young woman because of her hijab by the Guidance Patrol, or as Westerners called it, morality police. It prompted a quite progressive movement named Women Life Freedom. Many Iranian women refused to wear hijab as a form of protest against the backwardness of the regime's gendered institutions and laws. Many famous Iranian actresses, in solidarity with this movement, took off their hijab and even got arrested. Taraneh Dosti, one of the most decorated Iranian actresses who played Rana in The Salesman, is just one example of many of these actresses to pay the price of going to prison for standing with people. This shift from the reformist discourse to dismantling and disobedience discourse affected Iranian cinema as well. Now, directors like Jafar Panahi, who have been already in prison and were famous for making their films without considering the state's dictated censorship, gained prominence much more than before within the Iranian film community. Mohammad Rasoulof is one other director who has been commended for his uncompromising bravery in regards to making films on so many taboo subjects in Iran and under serious risk, which at times resulted in him getting detained or spent time in prison. However, there's a major difference between someone like Panahi and Rasoulof in terms of their films and their subjects. Rasoulof is more direct in tackling the issues that are imposed politically by the Islamic Republic than Panahi. Particularly in his latest film, the subject is about the Women Life Freedom movement. The story is about Iman, a recently appointed state prosecutor, and his family going through the events of 2022. His two daughters, both from a generation that has been deemed as instigators of the movement, become more distant and rebellious from their father despite their mother's efforts, as the film progressed to the point that eventually the father is killed in a quite apparent allegorical ending. The film, as I discussed, met with the praise from the Western world. A lot of that praise, I suspect, is not about how good the film actually is, but rather the circumstances in which Rasoulof and his team had to endure to make the film and smuggle it to Germany. Even on Metacritic, the film has a score of 84 and a must-see tag. But when you read most reviews, they do not fail to mention the incidents beyond the movie. It almost looks like they have to praise the film because of it. Now, in Iran, many critics lamented that the explicit political message of the film has been preferred by the filmmakers rather than telling a good story. To some extent, I do agree with this statement. On the other hand, I don't believe explicit political message or overall political film is necessarily going to disrupt the flow of stories. Quite the contrary, I do believe we need such stories, not only in Iran, but around the world. However, here in Iran, there are so many obstacles to actually making a good film about politics. Not only direct censorship from the Ministry of Culture is going to impact the production of the film, as is the case for this film, but also the pre-production of the film is going to be affected by the system that in any part of its political arenas has red lines. So one can't go research freely about the dynamics of such institutions like judiciary system, especially the political section of it, and explore about the families that are this deep within the system that are reckoned are quite different from a normal family in Iran. So fundamentally, I think this obstacle, the lack of research, is the most crucial factor to make a believable film about characters that belong to those systems of power. In my view, the seed of the sacred fiqh is the victim of such obstacles. Aside from the lack of research and characters that are not believable, the other problem with this film is simplifying the political dissent in Iran. This is the aspect that I have the most problem with in this film. It almost looks like a hashtag film. The headlines, especially the Western corporate media headlines about the woman life freedom movement, is everywhere in this film. The political reifications, like how this is the movement which is propagated by TikTok generation of Iran, the criticism the film has for the mother as the indecisive group that didn't participate in the protest and therefore are complicit with the oppressive regime. More importantly, the historical implication of these political reifications that do not consider the resistance of Iranians since the Islamic revolution that led to this movement. Above all, the film is Hear Our Voice film, one of the most repeated hashtags by Iranians during the movement, which to me more than anything is looking to the Western world and saying, look at us, we are like you, we're civilized. It's the aspect that I really get frustrated with, and this film implicitly is the manifestation of it. With that said, I'm not suggesting that Rasoulof intentionally wanted to make a festival film. This film, however wrong about its political depictions, is also an indication of how much the nation and state are getting away from each other. And Iranian cinema is probably one of the most direct grounds on which filmmakers display this detachment. That's why someone like Asghar Farhadi, who used to compromise with the Iranian system of censorship, is now not willing to do that. And even if he does, the public opinion can't have it. The attention this film had from the Western world, especially in terms of getting nominated for the Oscars, along with the mentioned media coverage surrounding the production of the film, is also an indication of how much Americans and the Western world had been influenced by the movement in 2022 in Iran. They, however, may be simplified, clearly understand that so many groups of people in Iran are not happy with the current political establishment of Iran. That's why I suspect that will the current regime be in place, we're not going to see any other Oscar-nominated films from the state of Iran in the future. Maybe Iranian directors from other countries, as is the case with the seed of the sacred fiqh, as both the Americans who are not going to be kind to films that obviously made with the current censorship system of the state, and the Iranian regime that's more cynical than ever before about the Iranian filmmakers who are respected by the Western world. As I made the video, there has been a new round of negotiations between Iran and the new government of Trump. In my view, even if these talks lead to a new deal, the trajectory of Oscar-nominated Iranian cinema indicates how unlikely it is to see a stable relation between the two countries. The optimism that we Iranians had to change the political structure of the country within the system, and the Western world that expected a more cooperative behavior from the reformist government at the time of the first Iranian Oscar-nominated film, has been replaced by a clear animosity between the Iranian people and the regime in the last Iranian Oscar-nominated picture. And the outside world, especially the Western world, is well aware of that. As for the Iranian cinema, I think we are going to see many films with an explicit political message. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. The future decides. So what do you think, guys? How does the future hold for the Iranian cinema or Iran-US relations with regards to what I explained here? If you want to support me, the best way is to subscribe to the channel and like the video and watch other videos that I made here. Thank you.